Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining today for this event with CAUKIN. I hope you've been able to watch many of the other events that have happened over the past week. I hope you enjoyed this week's exhibition, the WSA Festival, and there's still plenty more to go for today, including this talk and some evening events as well. So I hope you're able to join for that. But for now, I'll pass it over to Josh from CAUKIN, hope you enjoy. And after the talk, we'll be able to have about a 10-minute session for Q&A. So if you've got any questions that you think of throughout the talk, then of course just wait till the end, and then I'll be able to give those through to Josh. So okay, over to you.
Awesome, thanks for that. I guess, thank you for inviting us to speak. We feel very grateful for that. I guess I want to start by saying that we're aware that we've given quite a few lectures at the WSA over the last kind of couple of years. So anyone that has seen one of those lectures before, I apologise, it's going to be the same lecture. But I see a few familiar faces, or rather names, in the attendees panel. So hi to those of you that are here, and thanks for joining. I'm going to give a kind of real overview of CAUKIN and the work we've been doing for the last 7 years now in this presentation, and try and give you a bit of an idea about where we've come from and hopefully where we're heading. So we are CAUKIN Studio, an architectural social enterprise that use kind of design and construction projects internationally as a vehicle to create an impact through architecture. So, as I said, we've been doing this for 7 years now, and over that time, we've kind of developed a bit of a mission statement, or an ethos, if you like, and that is democratic education, quality design that's accessible to all. So, we really believe that every human being should have the opportunity and tools to shape the spaces they inhabit, that we should all benefit from the quality of life that's achieved through informed design, and that construction has to reduce its environmental impact on our planet. And we kind of operate all of our projects, no matter where they are or what the kind of project brief is, through 3 key pillars. So the first of which is designing through collaboration. So by that, we mean working with the end users and all of the stakeholders involved in a project to design in a fully collaborative manner. So that's right from the very onset of a first discussion about maybe a future project, building a brief with the community, and a team of end users, and then going right through all of the design stages and making sure that the end user's voice is heard throughout all of that process. And that really helps us from the very early stage of a project to gain the end user's ownership over the building, and to really kind of gain their full integrated input into that process. The next of which is learn through building. So I suppose continuing that collaboration through to the actual construction and on-site works. It kind of does what it says on the tin. We want to get hands-on with the tools. That's both international participants that come on our projects, architecture students, engineering students, design students, etc., from all over the world, but also members of the local community, both skilled and unskilled, making sure that everyone's kind of using construction as an opportunity to learn and to hopefully create kind of future options for employability. I think we feel that as architects, being able to pick up the tools and really understand how a building goes together by actually doing it is an invaluable skill to have, and can kind of improve our design work when we're back here in the UK as a result. And then finally, experience through immersion. So on almost all of our projects, we are living alongside the end users and communities that we're working with and for. And that helps us to gain a really deep understanding of ways of life, ways of the local culture and the context in which we're working, kind of more than you would ever get if you were a tourist visiting one of these locations. And that helps us when it comes to design and comes to furthering our work in certain localities, is that because we have a much better understanding of ways of life through living alongside these people for long amounts of time, we're able to design better buildings because of it. Really understanding how these people use the spaces that they inhabit, which might be different culturally to the way we would here in the UK. And in addition to that, it's a really great way to create a really amazing bond with someone who potentially is on the other side of the world. So it all kind of started back in 2015 when we were studying architecture at Cardiff University. We were a group of friends. There was about 5 of us to start with. And we'd finished our second year and were facing a long summer ahead of us, and wondering what to do with ourselves. And at the time, a lot of our kind of friends and colleagues were doing internships and work experiences at various offices around the UK. And whilst we saw value in doing that, I think we felt that we wanted to kind of get more practical and hands-on with gaining some experience. So we set about by contacting charities and NGOs all over the world, basically saying, look, we're an enthusiastic group of architecture students. We're proposing that we can design and build you a space that might help further your mission or your operations in some way. And after endless hours of emailing and phone calling and trying to kind of gain contact with various charities, organizations and NGOs everywhere, a charity called the Friends of Coco got back to us. They're based on the island of Cambodia, off the coast of Cambodia. And they just set up a school on the island, which was starting to become a location that was kind of getting plagued by some of the negative impacts of tourism, such as kind of partying, drugs, alcohol abuse. And the kids on the island were being subject to that, or at least were kind of witnessing that happen in front of their eyes, and didn't necessarily have a kind of safe space or somewhere to go outside of school hours to kind of relax, get away from those negative impacts of tourism, but also maybe explore themselves kind of creatively through play. So this charity said, look, we'd love it if you could build us like a sort of outdoor classroom learning space, but also playground that gives these children that kind of safe haven. And at the time, we were kind of proposing that we were going to fund it as well as design it and build it. So the risks for the NGO were fairly low. All they have to do was kind of give us a site and help us out with kind of local contacts and hope that we don't make a mess of it. So even then, we spent a long time kind of Skyping and discussing with the charity how we were going to do it and what we were going to do, and trying to help kind of build up that trust. But this was the kind of end result, Playscape. And after 8 weeks of construction, this is what we came up with. But I think that for us as young architecture students at that time, we'd kind of massively underestimated the value we were going to gain from doing this and from working with local people. Most importantly, I think, we understood that we had very limited construction experience, but we found that obviously the local people's knowledge of the context, material availability, their knowledge of construction was far deeper than ours ever was. And we learned so much through that process of construction and working alongside the local people to gain the skills that they already have in the construction. But we found that there was actually this really nice kind of knowledge exchange where actually some of the design skills that we had and some of the design methods that we'd implemented in the construction of Playscape was something that we could teach local people too. So there was this really nice kind of back and forth relationship that we had where we'd teach design and we'd learn construction. And it was a really valuable experience for us as architecture students. And I think one that we felt that we just had to keep doing more of and going back to these kind of places and doing this time and time again. Kind of skip forward quite a few years now. Over the time, we've obviously built a business model and an operating structure around how we work on these projects. And we've now identified that every project requires 6 key stakeholders for it to kind of go forward and hopefully occur successfully. So the first of which obviously is the end user and local community. They're providing their knowledge, their time and resource in helping through the whole kind of design and construction process. But they're also, as I've said before, taking in international participants and welcoming us into their kind of village and into their homes. And they're obviously then becoming the recipients of a building, however large, small, whatever the brief is. We've then got the NGO or community partner. They're a really key one at the start of any project and throughout the whole process as well. We rely on them to help us to identify a brief and to interact with the local community and ourselves. I think a key part of that is that the NGOs that have been working in the location for a long time, or kind of local figureheads that have been working or that live within the community, obviously have the trust of that community. And that's something that if it was for us to go in fresh, we'd have to spend a very long amount of time in that place to be able to really understand the needs of local people and gain their trust as well. So we can kind of shortcut that process by collaborating with an NGO or charity partner. And it's also their responsibility to fund the materials of the project as well. So then there's the international participants. So as I said before, architecture, design, engineering-based students looking to kind of gain a hands-on experience in construction, as well as work alongside other like-minded individuals from all over the world to get this kind of mashup of lots of different outlooks on life, outlooks on design, and kind of becomes a massive melting pot of ideas and obviously construction experience as well. We've then got local skilled workers. So we'll identify through the help of the NGO or local figureheads, members of the local area and community that have specific skills. So maybe they're really experienced carpenters, welders, bricklayers, etc. We'll identify them early on in the process and again work with them through the kind of design phases so that once we get on site, these people are the ones that kind of lead the charge from a construction perspective alongside our team. And their responsibility is to not only help with education of the international participants that are coming on our projects, but also to educate younger, more unskilled members of the local community, again, to help upskill and provide kind of future employment opportunities from the process as well as their obviously vast understanding of local logistics, construction methods, materials, etc. We've then got sponsors and donors. So they're often an extension of either ourselves or the charity. And these are people that are providing resource to the project either through professional advice like structural engineers or environmental design specialists to help add value to the design, or they're providing financial resource to help with covering the cost of materials for the project, etc. And they're obviously doing that in return for kind of the kind of corporate social responsibility benefits that come from having your name to a project like this. And then there's obviously us, our team, CAUKIN Studio team, who are the kind of facilitators for the project and hope to kind of tie all of these stakeholders together to get the value out of all of the stakeholders, as well as obviously managing the whole design and construction process from start to finish. So we kind of have some key project selection objectives when we look to start a new project. And that's either whether we're going ourselves to find a project or people are coming to us. We'll kind of put it through this evaluation criteria. And one of the first things is that it's requested by local people and the local community. It's got approval from the relevant authorities in the local area or from, say, for example, the chief of the village and the kind of hierarchy of the community. But also that it kind of satisfies one or more of these kind of three objectives here. So it has a community-wide social impact. So by that we mean a building that can impact more than just maybe one person or a small group of people. So things like schools, healthcare facilities, kindergartens, or community halls, they are buildings that an entire community can interact with and kind of gain social impact in that way. A long-term economic impact. So obviously, through the process of building these buildings, there's employment opportunities there in the construction phases, but also looking at actually building buildings that create an income for the community as well. So, whether that's a product manufacturing facility like the example here, which I'll talk about a bit later on, or it's through renting out the building as a space to use for meetings, etc. That helps to provide a longer term income for the community as well. And then finally, a low or positive environmental impact. So I suppose that's twofold. So we mean using low environmental impact materials that carry a lower embodied carbon, such as timber, trying to reduce the amount of concrete we're using in our buildings, etc. Using kind of materials that could either have another life or can be fully recycled to try and contribute to a bit of a circular economy. Or we also mean by that working with partners, NGOs, charities on briefs for projects that have an environmental agenda. So again, I think I'll speak about this project a bit later on, but working with organisations that are pushing forward their environmental agenda through the project. So skipping back in time again now, after we'd done the first project, Playscape, we went on to work on 2 further projects in Indonesia, which were again 2 kind of small-scale playground builds. This time, we kind of involved a wider range of participants. So the first build was just kind of a bunch of mates. I think there was 12 of us, all friends studying at Cardiff University. And the following 2 playgrounds, we decided let's kind of branch out and open this opportunity up to more students, people that we don't necessarily know. So that's when we kind of started to run the projects as if it was a kind of construction workshop. But following those kind of 3 playground builds, I think, we'd reached a point where we were kind of satisfied with some of the knowledge we'd gained in construction and understanding of how we can kind of manage and run these projects and interact with communities and try and get the most out of that process. And we decided, we really wanted to try and scale up the complexity of the buildings, but also the impact that we could have as well. So working with more people on larger buildings that have, a larger brief, and also the capacity to involve and impact upon more people. So again, we kind of repeated that process of reaching out to NGOs and charities all over the world, and hit upon a charity in Fiji called the Nganga Giving Foundation. It's a charity that's managed by a British guy called Max. And I think maybe it was just that he liked the work we'd done already, or that we were British and he was British, and he was kind of, there was some synergy there. I don't know, but he was really receptive to our idea and our proposal of working with his charity to kind of build larger infrastructure. As it happened, this was also kind of timed with when Fiji had been hit the previous year by Cyclone Winston, which had destroyed a lot of buildings across Fiji, left a lot of devastation in its wake, and had destroyed, a lot of kind of key community infrastructure. So there was a lot of funding going into rebuilding some of these kind of community buildings, and the charity had also received some donations from overseas to help with that effort. So I suppose it was the right place at the right time, as well as kind of spending a lot of time working with Max and the local communities on Skype. I think we Skyped kind of 2 hours at least once a week, every week for a solid year, to kind of make sure we knew what we were going to try and do with this project and where it could potentially lead, and cover all bases, basically. But that led to the completion of our first 2 much larger scale builds in Fiji. So this was the Noeli Kindergarten, and then we also did a community hall. And again, that helped us to really build upon this network of stakeholders and helped us better understand our kind of operating structure and project structure. So obviously, every single project we work on, there's a number of key design considerations from start to finish, and that includes whilst we're designing on site as well. And I suppose it's our main objective to try and overcome all of these design considerations in balance, so that we can come up with the best building that can hopefully provide the most impact, but also the most value to the community as well. So the first of those is budget. Obviously, we're often, as I said, we're working with charities and NGOs. Often the budget is either very limited or has a strict red line. We can't get halfway through construction and have to go to ask back to the charity to ask for any more money. So that means when we're designing, we have to really kind of value engineer as much of the building as possible and make sure that we're kind of getting multiple uses into kind of the same space as we can. But it also means we're trying to count all of the nuts, bolts, screws, bits of timber as we can, and planning in those contingencies so that when we do get to site, we don't have a situation where we've run out of money and materials. So trying to factor that in as much as we can. We then got climate. So obviously we're working in a number of different countries. We're working across 7 continents in 12 different countries at the moment. And actually that's due to grow very soon. So there's a whole host of different climatic conditions we've got to consider during the design process. Obviously with Fiji, we're talking about hurricanes and cyclones, whereas in other areas it might be earthquakes, tsunamis, that sort of thing, flooding, etc. So I think really key, again, in the design process to work with those key stakeholders who provide that added value in design, so structural engineers, environmental design specialists, to overcome some of these kind of climatic conditions and add as much value to the design as we possibly can through our network of kind of professional expertise. So the next one, which is materials. Again, this one's really key, that we're always using locally available and locally sourced materials. And the reason for that is that, twofold. Firstly, that helps to further reduce the environmental impact and embodied carbon of the materials we're using. If they're sourced from right next to site, obviously there's no carbon being wasted on transporting of those materials. It's just carried by hand, and it is a much better way to reduce that impact. But also, if we're specifying materials that are imported from overseas, for example, once we've finished a project, if we'd specify those overseas materials, it's unlikely that the local community would then be able to specify them again in their future builds. So we want to ensure that we're using locally available resource in maybe new and innovative ways to kind of further design, so that once we've left, the community can then adopt some of those design techniques again in the future, and hopefully design their future buildings better as a result, using those entirely locally available resource. The next, which is skill level. This one kind of ties into the same kind of points I made about materials. Again, we don't want to be designing buildings that are incredibly complex or require incredibly high skilled labor to construct. Again, so that once we've finished and left the building, the community can then continue to realize similar buildings or use similar construction methods without the need for us or other high skilled labor. Again, that also means that when we're designing, we have to try and think of ways in which we can kind of add repetition to the buildings. So, for example, the portal frame design technique, which can be seen in a lot of our buildings, is a really good way to overcome this kind of consideration. So essentially, once an unskilled team has learned to build one or two frames, it's then just a case of repeating that process, and suddenly you've got kind of 10 frames or 15 frames for a whole building in the space of a couple of days, where actually maybe it took 1 or 2 days to learn to just build the first one. You can then repeat that very quickly, and suddenly you've got a structural system out of nowhere that's very easy to repeat. The next, which is time. So again, we're generally working to quite tight time scales on a lot of our projects. I think to date, our projects have been completed anywhere between 1 week and about 3.5 months, being the longest one. So it's generally quite a quick turnaround. And the reason for that is obviously that the cost of being on site is high. So if we can reduce that time, then that brings the cost down. But also, obviously, the international participants that are coming away on our projects only have a set amount of time that they can work on a project. And we try to aim to make sure that from start to finish, you, as a participant, you get to see the entire process of construction as a valuable kind of learning point. So when we're designing, again, that means we have to try and design as many construction processes on site at one time as possible, or at least plan for that. So, for example, it might be that we have a team prefabricating those portal frames or trusses and structure, whilst another part of the site, we've got a team digging, preparing, measuring, and laying the foundations, so that you have lots of processes going on at one time. And then usually during the kind of middle section of a project, it all comes together, and suddenly you've got kind of a structural frame and a building out of nowhere. It's a very quick process. The penultimate one is information, or rather lack of information. So, we're often designing to things like Google Earth, even just photographs of site, the kind of topography tool on Google Earth. And although it's not that accurate, it's often not viable, or it wouldn't be within budget to get a site surveyor out there to the site to kind of get detailed information. So when we're designing buildings, we have to ensure that we're designing flexibility into their systems, so that, again, if we do arrive to site with the limited information we've had during the design process, if there is a kind of like a unforeseen circumstance, like a drop in the landfall, or actually the water table's higher than we envisaged, it means that we can overcome that quite quickly through this flexible and adaptable design. And then finally, not necessarily the case on all of our projects, but definitely seems to be increasingly on more and more of our projects, is access. So sometimes we're working in such remote and rural sites that actually getting to them is something we have to factor into a design of a building. It might be that actually getting to the site costs a lot of money, so therefore that affects the design and also affects kind of the materials we're using and how we can get those to the site as well. So the example here is the Bula Batiki coconut oil processing plant, and the only way you could access the site or even access the whole island was through a small gap in the reef, and you could only get through that on a fiberglass boat, which you can see on the left in this image here, which meant that the materials that were coming from the mainland had to be shipped on a large shipping container on the right-hand side of the image here, offloaded onto the small fiberglass boat, and then driven through the gap in the reef onto the site. So from a design point of view, that meant that we couldn't necessarily specify really long lengths of timber or really heavy elements, because that would mean too many boat trips, or it wouldn't be viable on the small fiberglass boat. So yeah, we have to kind of tie that into the design process and consider that a factor as well. So hopefully, yeah, balancing all of these key design considerations to come up with a better building as a result. So I'll kind of run through a few of our key projects and highlight some of the key kind of factors of those projects as well. So the first of which is the Ram West School, which is located in Vanuatu. Again, a small group of islands in the South Pacific, if you've never heard of it before, not that far from Fiji. And this project came to us through a charity that's based in the UK, but has done a considerable amount of work in Vanuatu on the island of Pentecost. And unfortunately, Cyclone Pam, I believe it was, in 2015 tore through Vanuatu, which was then followed by Cyclone Harold in Fiji the year after, again causing widespread devastation, wiping out a lot of kind of school and community infrastructure. And the Tambok Project charity had identified a need for 2 schools in 2 separate villages, one of which was Ramwas. But they'd also identified this kind of unique need because of the climatic conditions of the village. So basically, because the village was located at a certain altitude on the mountain, they had this but despite it being a tropical climate, they had this interesting issue where they had really high humidity levels and moisture levels, condensation levels all year round, which meant that in their old classroom before it was wiped out by the cyclone, their kind of blackboard was constantly covered in condensation. Learning materials that they had in their small library, which the charity had been supplying, would get kind of sodden with this condensation and destroyed much quicker than you would expect a book to last. So the charity found that they were kind of constantly sending out new learning material, and obviously that was kind of hindering the children's opportunities as well. So they said, whilst we want you to build a classroom that can hopefully withstand future natural disasters, we also want to see if you can kind of use natural design methods to overcome this weird kind of moisture issue that we've got. So we worked with environmental design specialists at Cardiff University to come up with a design that didn't need any kind of dehumidifier or air conditioning unit to overcome this issue. So using natural design methods to try and reduce the moisture in the space that the books were stored. So those kind of methods were basically cladding and wrapping the library space in corrugated iron that was painted black. So the idea was that the solar radiation would heat the space within, which would lower the relative humidity. When that was coupled with lots of natural ventilation, this kind of moisture-rich air would then be drawn out of the building to reduce the kind of moisture that is in contact with the books. We also coupled that with, you can see here, these kind of bookshelves where there was spaces fairly regularly, again, to try and create more air circulation around the books to wick the moisture away in the process. And since completing that project, we've been monitoring the humidity levels in all of the spaces across the whole school. And the library space has been showing a reduction of relative humidity by 20%. So that's obviously really great to see. And we'll be building upon that, hopefully, when we visit Tambok Village next summer, fingers crossed, on the second school that was originally identified by the charity. So this one here is Naili Community Hall in Fiji, probably one of our better known buildings. it was, again, a building that was born, or a need that was born as a result of the kind of cyclone in Fiji. The community had been without the community hall since the cyclone, or their previous community hall had been in bad disrepair for a number of years, and the cyclone that hit in 2016 basically wiped it out altogether. So there was an obvious need for another community hall, but an interesting kind of brief element to this one was also that 90 Community are very well known for having a really good choir and meke group. So the meke is a traditional form of dance, war dance, traditionally in Fiji. And this is their choir and meke performances are something that they do regularly to visiting groups of tourists from local hotels. So there was this need identified for like a performance space or somewhere that could enhance their performances to the visitors, and hopefully again create an inflated income stream for the village as well. So the whole design was focused around this kind of crescendoing shape. The idea being that these 3 pivot doors that you can see at the front, when they're open and counterweight hung, they then frame the stage so that performances can be led either from outside looking into the space, or from inside looking out. And again, this was another project that proposed logistic issues that we never really faced before. So kind of, I suppose, design considerations from a practical point of view that I guess you can never really plan for. And that was that these are kind of massive pine poles that you can see here that form this exoskeleton. They were all kind of 10 meters long, weighed half a ton, and arrived on a flatbed truck, which is where they'd come from in the local town, where they'd obviously been loaded onto the truck by a crane. But now we're in a village and we don't have access to a crane or any heavy machinery. So the only way we were going to get these 32 pine poles off the truck was by hand. So looking for an innovative method to do that. And we spent a long time, a couple of hours trying to deliberate how to do it and trialing and erroring. We kind of got one off by levering it with wooden poles, but that wasn't really working. And one of the guys in the local rugby team said, well, why don't we just tie a rope to the end of it and just drag them all off the back? And within the space of about 10 minutes, they dragged the remaining 30 pine poles off the back of the truck rather efficiently. So again, it's trying to factor in some of these unforeseen issues that crop up on site and overcoming them through design and practical thinking. So this one in Zambia, one of our largest builds to date, was the Evergreen School. Actually, again, a project that was born through Cardiff University, or rather through a professor who operates a charity called Mothers of Africa. And Judith Hall, she's based in Cardiff University, but has been working with Evergreen School and in the local area for many years now. And they'd identified a need at the school for more classrooms because attendance numbers had risen to sort of 150 pupils per class or per teacher. So there was a massive need for more space. So they came to us with a brief of building 4 additional classrooms and a teacher's office to help employ more teachers, but also reduce classroom sizes down to around 40 to 45 children per class, giving all the kids a kind of better access to learning. But again, this was quite an important one for us because I think, we find that often in a lot of the kind of contexts and locations we're working in, prescribed gender roles, especially in the construction industry, are very prevalent. And I think we feel that by leading through example, we can hopefully overcome some of those issues. So obviously, women in construction is a bit of a taboo in Zambia. And we felt that by employing a team of 50% women, 50% men on site, we could lead by example and show that women are perfectly capable, if not more capable, than the men working on the site. And again, especially important as it's a school where there was lots of young women attending, they'd be able to see these strong, capable women working on site and maybe hopefully realize that actually a career in the construction industry could be perfectly viable. So in addition to that, we also employed a labour force of 50% unskilled labourers. In fact, I think it was actually a larger percentage than that. So that again, through education on site and through working with skilled contractors, we could upskill these members and hopefully provide future employability opportunities. So I said I'd touch on this project, a kind of environmental impact project. This was down at the Eden Project in Cornwall, which I'm sure many of you would have heard of. And the Eden Project had recently become a recognised bee reserve for native dark honeybees, which are a bee population that are under threat from imports of bees from Europe and further afield. And so a charity called the B4 Project that's done a lot of research around our native honeybees basically wanted to create a sculptural intervention and pavilion that would raise awareness of some of these issues, would displace a lot of their research, as well as display a kind of live functioning beehive, which would contain the native dark honeybees. So you could see them doing their thing. So behind that kind of wooden box that you can see there is that beehive behind a glass screen, and you can kind of see them formulating all the honeycomb and pollinating and creating honey, etc. So yeah, it was about creating this kind of beacon structure that would kind of draw users up to the site and would give them the opportunity to dwell there and also read some of the information and research that the B4 charity had been doing. And again, this project was actually designed and built using scaffolding, which was donated by the original scaffolding supplier that supplied the Eden Project. So hopefully, some of these actual poles were used in the construction of the Eden Project, and now they've kind of come full circle and are now in this installation. And I think, we hope that in a few years' time, or 10, 20 years' time, when this installation's kind of come to an end of its lifespan, these scaffold poles could be used elsewhere for other means, again, hoping to further contribute to that circular economy. So this example, again, I'm aware of time, so I'll be fairly quick, but this example is the economic impact that I was talking about. Also the building where we had to get all of the materials onto the site via a small boat. So this is the Bula Batiki coconut oil processing plant. Again, located in Fiji on the island of Batiki. And the brief for this came about because there are 4 villages on the island, and they'd formed this cooperative to create coconut oil, which they'd started to sell kind of across Fiji. And their small community-run business had kind of grown to a point where they were needing to produce quite a large volume of coconut oil to sell across Fiji. And they kind of run out of space to do that in. So they were doing it in the kind of community hall, in their own homes, even on occasion in the church. So basically the objective was to design a purpose-built processing facility so that they would be able to reclaim their own spaces and do all of the processing within this building. The other objective was to also reach a kind of higher level of food hygiene standards so that they would be able to sell to a wider audience and sell more internationally to kind of New Zealand, Australia, even the UK. Again, to help raise that level of income, sustainable income, to help them then fund further community development projects. So again, this was 8 weeks on site, although through material delays, etc., I think it actually ended up only being about 6.5 weeks in which we had to complete the building. So, a lot of pressure there under the construction period. But since completion of this, the Prime Minister of Fiji has opened the building, and coconut oil has been produced, and they are now selling that kind of further afield. We've also been told that the business is currently under talks with a large kind of surf and outdoor brand who we're in discussion to kind of produce surf wax from coconut oil and from some of the kind of byproducts of the processing of the process. So that's really great to see, and great to see that they're kind of expanding their product range, and maybe there'll be a need for even extending the facility in future as well. So a key thing for us is evaluating all of our projects and hoping that by evaluating and revisiting our projects, we can then kind of design and build more successfully in future in those kind of locations. So this one, the Weni Kindergarten, back in 2017, those first kind of 2 key builds in Fiji, The brief for this came about because the school at Nweni had basically been teaching their kindergarten kids out of what used to be an old canteen. It was small, it was very dimly lit, not very well ventilated. It was only big enough for about 8 to 10 kids. So it wasn't a very practical or enjoyable space for the kids to learn in. So our brief was to kind of design and build a purpose-built kindergarten that would enable them to kind of grow the numbers of kids and just was sort of a far more productive space generally as well. And what we actually found after completing this project and revisiting it the year after was that attendance numbers had grown from those original 8 up to 35, and up to 30 kids. And the kindergarten teachers were having to now turn parents and kids away to say, look, we don't have capacity to teach anymore. And so whilst it was really great to see that attendance had grown massively, it also highlighted the importance of kind of trying to preempt or predict what those knock-on effects of doing a project might be, and as well as designing space flexibly as well. So we kind of went back then to our NGO partner and said, look, this is now something that we've observed and we've seen a need for even more classroom space. The school had recently employed a second kindergarten teacher. So we said to the charity, look, let's try and build another classroom that can help them increase their attendance numbers to kind of over 50 kids. So we went back in 2019 now it was, to create that space and utilize that second kindergarten teacher, and have kind of regularly kept in touch with the teachers over there. And again, they're kind of enrolling more and more students now, which is really great to see. And part of that process, this tree that you can see on the right here, whilst we'd kind of gone back and revisited the space and spent a bit of time there, we observed that a lot of the parents and kids kind of before and after school were spending a lot of time sheltering under a tree that was next to the kindergarten in the limited shade. So we kind of identified this need for a bit of a sheltered space that the parents could wait after school so they could pick up their kids. So we designed this kind of experimental play shelter structure out of timber that's supposed to look like a tree. And again, that was born out of revisiting and trying to understand the project's needs as a result. So as well as kind of evaluating on a project basis, it's also looking at how as a company we are creating impact and growing as a company. So kind of summarizing some of the key numbers there, over lockdown, well, even I say back in 2020 now, that was obviously unique, I think it's probably about a year ago now, we produced our first impact report and really took a deep look and tried to understand what impact we'd had to date, but also set objectives for how we could further our impact in future. And, some of the key statistics here are nearly 120,000, well, it's more than 120,000 now, hours taught on site, 1,300 square meters of safer structures. Yes, I think hopefully highlighting that, impact of an architectural structure doesn't necessarily have to just be within the completed structure itself, that actually throughout the entire process of design and construction, you can have an impact and arguably a more sustainable and widespread impact through education of local people, as well as the completion of the building and for whatever function that's intended. So I'll just kind of, how long we've got? We've got 10 minutes. So yeah, I'll just briefly touch on some of the things that we've been working on since. And obviously a lot of our work has been very international up until lockdown hit. We've done a couple of smaller projects in the UK, obviously the Eden build being one of them. But I think, lockdown made us kind of take a step back to understand what we were doing and also see how we can potentially implement some of these kind of techniques and ways of approaching design and construction projects, but close to home in the UK. So looking to tackle kind of social, environmental, economic issues here, such as mental health, homelessness, loneliness, that sort of thing. So working on research projects and doing competitions, but also looking at the kind of diversity issue within the built environment and seeing how we can kind of tackle that from the ground up. So we're currently working with a number of schools to deliver design and construction workshops, generally schools that are in less privileged areas in the UK and that have a larger diversity of students as well, to hopefully give some of these kids an eye into what a career in design and construction might look like, and hopefully open their eyes to maybe considering it as a viable potential future career. So we've actually recently completed a construction at Nottage Primary School, which is in Wales. And we're currently working on another one in Coventry and another two in rural Wales as well. And then in addition to that, we've been kind of running virtual design workshops. So these are basically, I say virtual design workshops is what it says in the tin, but based around specific research topics that we're really interested in as a practice, and that hopefully by involving, again, international participants and building this kind of mass of research and understanding, we could then tackle some of those research topics kind of more head on as well. So yeah, I suppose thanks for listening. If anyone wants, follow us on Instagram at CAUKIN Studio, and I guess I'll open the floor to any questions if there are. Thanks for listening.
Okay, great. Thank you, Josh, for that. That was very good. I really enjoyed that talk. I'm sure everyone else did too. Of course, if anyone who has any questions, please do drop it in the Q&A box. And yeah, we can answer those now.
It's that Friday feeling.
Yeah. I'm sure everyone's been to a lot of the other events as well. I guess maybe it's quite a lot now. I'm not sure.
Adana in the chat said, would you be able to touch more upon the material selection? How the considerations of local resources affect this? Yeah, I guess it's often, one of the first things, or one of the very early stages of a project, in the kind of brief formulation stage, where we're working to understand what resources are available, and how we can use them in maybe more innovative ways to create safer structures. So either, more structurally sound or better ventilated, better lighted, etc. I think we do that obviously through questions and answers. That's the most efficient way, through the NGO and the community partners, but also through really studying lots of photographs of the local area, of the site, and doing as much research from a desktop study as we can. And then often, going away and looking at potentially a few different methods we could use, and then feeding them back to the community and saying, is this something that you see as viable? Is this a material we can use, or can we use this material in this way? And kind of always putting that question back to the community as well. So often, it's generally led by what the vernacular is. Obviously, a lot of our buildings in the South Pacific, in fact, all of our buildings in the South Pacific, have been constructed out of timber, which is a very common material used there. Whereas obviously the one in Zambia was built out of kind of masonry and steel construction, again, because of the kind of local material availability. So I suppose I mentioned kind of importing of, or rather avoiding the import of materials from overseas. It's an example of that is trying to identify how maybe an imported material, which could be a better solution, how we could kind of replicate that, but using local materials in a slightly different way. So a physical example of that is that in the first buildings we set out to build in Fiji, so the kindergarten and the community hall, the engineers specified these kind of steel footings, and we could only source them in New Zealand. And whilst that was not only incredibly expensive, it was also going to take a long time, and just we couldn't source them in Fiji, so it wasn't really an option. But obviously one of the key characteristics that they bought was a solid anchor point from the structure and the column into the ground. So it was then looking at how we could use local techniques for foundations to create a similar sort of detail and junction that creates, a similar sort of strength. So we came up with this kind of pine pole male to female connection where the column sits over the top of this kind of pine pole. So it's, in a sense, the pine pole is basically what would have been the steel footing. And that was all kind of bolted together and concreted into the ground to create a similar effect. So yeah, it's kind of looking at ways in which we can innovate with local materials, but to create those similar kind of outcomes.
We've had another question in the Q&A box. Says, can you explain about the opportunities as students other than workshops?
Well, obviously there is our workshops, there's the virtual design workshops and the physical construction workshops. We've got some of those open at the moment. So for next summer, obviously that's very coronavirus travel related. But we're also potentially looking at starting doing more in the UK, more construction workshops in the UK. So we did one actually very recently at a farm down in East Sussex that was looking at circular economy and designing using only materials that we kind of scavenged and found from around the farm site. So we're going to be looking at doing more of those. But I guess if you're alluding to kind of job opportunities or work experience, at the moment, it's not something, we don't have those positions open on our team, but we're always looking for kind of collaborators and new ideas. So if there's, a project that you feel passionate about as a student, or, maybe one you've worked on in your own design thesis through university, or, a personal connection you have to a community or a project brief, then we always love to hear from you guys. So, please do send us a message on Instagram or give us an email, info@caukinstudio.com. And we're always open to discussing kind of ways to collaborate with students as well. An example of that is actually an architect from Argentina who couldn't necessarily participate in our workshops, but did have a particular connection to an NGO in Argentina. And we've been working with her since to develop a brief with the NGO, with her and with the community. And now she's kind of working on that project with us, which we hope to get out to some point this year. So that would be one example of that.
We had another question in the chat saying, I'm just wondering if there are any project types you haven't built yet, but think could be very beneficial in a community/democratic design context.
Project types, as in like a hospital or a school sort of thing. Is that what you mean, Jack? Hi, Jack, by the way. For everyone else's benefit, Jack helped. He came out and joined us on the construction of the coconut oil processing plant. So I'm sure we'll have heard our lecture before, but yes, but an open question. Okay. Actually, one thing that we are working on right now is something that actually has come out of the pandemic and coronavirus. We obviously have seen this kind of shift in the way people work. A lot of companies being forced to work remotely, send their employees back home, or are kind of coming up with hybrid, 3 days in the office, 2 days at home sort of working patterns. We think that this remote way of working is here to stay. So we're actually looking at combining this movement in the way that we work with some of the kind of contexts and communities we worked in before to create co-working facilities in some of these places, but that also create an educational and resource hub for local communities. So, for example, a co-work hub in Fiji, whereby someone who can work remotely from the UK or Australia or New Zealand can go to this co-work hub and work remotely from there. But also it's somewhere where local members in the community in Fiji can access skills workshops, entrepreneurial workshops, and kind of educational resources to help further with kind of promotion of small business in some of these contexts. So I think co-working is something that we feel is an example of a building typology that we haven't yet built, but hope to further our work in. So hopefully that answers your question. I see Adana says we're running out of time. But yeah, also Sanjay, Bhutan sounds amazing. Send us a message. We'd love to hear more. We're always open to working in new contexts and locations. So yes, please do get in contact.
Okay, all right. Yeah, I think that will have to be the end. But yeah, thank you again, Josh, for having this talk. This has been great. Yeah, and yeah, now this session will move on to listening to a talk from Duncan Baker-Brown, from who's done a lot of work with trying to change the sort of building environment to a more sustainable sort of have a more sustainable impact. But yeah, we'll give it about a 5-minute break. I'm not sure, is it? I think probably a 5-minute break before we start, or I don't know if we're going straight into it.
Have a break, Cameron.
I'm not. All right, I think Idana's looking to start this. Okay, I'll hand it over to Idana then.
Awesome. Cheers.